This essay represents a revisionist view of Bartolomé de las Casas as the author of the introduction of African slaves to the Americas in the early 16th century. Here he is on your screen, the protagonist of our story, in an imagined scene painted in 1876 by Constantino Brumidi for the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Las Casas did, among other contemporaries, suggest the importation of African slaves to lift the burden of oppression off the Amerindians, but the full story is little known. We explore the meaning of African slavery in the context of the place and time where Las Casas grew up, Andalusia in southern Spain, where slavery was quite different from the way it developed on the plantations of the Americas. And we relate how Las Casas' theoretical and practical defense of Amerindians eventually was extended by him into a defense of liberty for all men, including African slaves. To reduce the impact of the Spanish, their demands, and their diseases on the islands of the Caribbean, the stuff of the Black Legend, and to meet the growing need for labor to work the fields and mines of these new lands, Las Casas recommended the importation of some slaves from Castile, or Africa. He has been pilloried ever since for hypocritically advocating the initiation of the African slave trade in defense of American Indians. What did he really advocate? Was he the first to do so, as many have claimed? Did he sustain and defend this trade, and even slavery, over his long life? Slaves in southern Iberia, where Las Casas grew up, were rarely used in agriculture or plantation slavery as would develop in the Americas. Rather, they fit into society much like the Moorish slaves who preceded them, eventually being absorbed into the local society, becoming members of Christian brotherhoods, developing a significant free-colored population, and as Herbert Klein noted, African slaves readily adopted the culture, language, and religion of their masters. They were not particularly deprived, oppressed, or stripped of much of their humanity as would occur in the plantations of the Americas by the 18th century. Between 1502 and 1510, on the other hand, Las Casas witnessed a brutal subjugation of the Taínos on the island of Hispaniola by Spanish settlers, all of which he eventually recorded in a short tract entitled A Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies. The brief history was soon translated into other European languages, and within a few years the Black Legend was well underway. When Las Casas the priest reached Cuba in 1511 and witnessed the pacification of those people, he turned on the whole sorry scene and devoted the rest of his life to protecting the American Indians. To do so, Las Casas suggested to King Charles's counselors that a license be issued to import Negro slaves directly from Spain or Africa to the islands. Later on, he reflected on this. This suggestion to issue a license to bring Negro slaves to the Indies was first made by the cleric Casas, he frequently wrote of himself in the third person, not seeing how unjust the Portuguese were in taking slaves on the coast of Africa. Later on, he realized how unjustly and tyrannically Africans were taking slaves in the same fashion as Indians. And in old age he turned on the slave trade and slavery itself. Since then he has been held accountable by some for a monstrous error, suggesting that Africans be imported into the islands to relieve the oppression on the Indians and supply Spaniards with labor. He was thus the initiator of the nefarious African slave trade, one of the cruelest and most heartless businesses in the history of humankind. Nothing could be further from the truth. This essay puts what Las Casas said and did into the context of his times, and more specifically into the context of his life. By doing so, it brings new insight into the beginnings of the African slave trade, the Americas, and directly into the search for true justice and liberty in the conquest of the Americas.